First, thanks to Hillsdale College and the Art of Biography series for inviting me here. I'm here because I wrote a biography of Mozart. It was my fourth musical bio, so each of them modeled in its style and approach to its subject, so each with its particular personality and challenges. I'll say that in writing the Mozart, I laughed more than with any of my other books. Wondering why, I realized that it had a lot to do with the joy in Mozart's music, but also partly by his letters, which can be rabidly obscene, but in any case are often hilarious. Mozart was a man who lustily embraced the whole of life and art. My nickname for him was Mr. Joie de Vivre. If that contradicts stories you may have heard of the suffering and impoverished and misunderstood Mozart finally buried in a pauper's grave, that's because none of those things are true. He had his troubles and his disappointments like the rest of us, but he was fundamentally a happy man. The only real tragedy in his life was that he died heartbreakingly young. Lectures are supposed to have a theme, and my theme here is centered on one of those tricky to translate German words, Bildung. It's sometimes translated as education, but that hardly conveys its scope. It involves the whole process of growing up, of growing in knowledge and understanding through experience, of emotional and moral development. Mozart's Bildung was unique because he was a unique character in history. Not in being a prodigy, because prodigies happen once in a while, but a prodigy whose reputation flew around the world as a scientific or theological marvel, depending on your point of view. At age 6, Mozart was one of the more famous people alive. And that fame and reputation has lasted to the present. Here, I'm going to give you a short tour of Mozart's Bildung as he lived it. This means I'm going to be concentrating on his first 2 decades. The next decades, many of you know already, the music. Most of you probably have some idea of how it started. As I say in my book, you can, as a matter of faith, believe in miracles, but you don't expect them to happen in the living room. It was January 24th, 1761, a few days before Wolfgang's 5th birthday. Leopold, at that point, was a violinist in the court orchestra of Salzburg, a busy teacher, one of the leading musicians in town. He had published a violin method that made him modestly celebrated. At the same time, he was a prolific and well-regarded composer, turning out symphonies, serenades, and other works of modest ambition. And on that January day in Salzburg, with no training on keyboard and not able to read music, 4-year-old Wolfgang played and memorized a piece from his sister's workbook with impeccable accuracy and rhythm. He began to play and memorize one piece after another from his sister's workbook. His older sister, Nannerl, was in the process of becoming a keyboard prodigy. Soon, Wolfgang was composing little pieces on the model of the ones he knew. Here's his first, a minuet, written at age 5. So that's where it all started. Of course, the pieces exists in Leopold's hand because Wolfgang still couldn't read music. And of course, then and later, Leopold made some corrections in Wolfgang's musical grammar. But Leopold made those corrections a matter of teaching. He largely left Wolfgang's notes intact. Wolfgang began to write longer and more ambitious pieces, keyboard and flute and violin sonatas, and always under his father's eye. In fact, his father's hand appears on his manuscripts into Mozart's 20s. Leopold Mozart was a deeply Catholic man, at the same time very much involved in the new humanistic currents of the time, this being the time of Voltaire and Rousseau and Kant, which we know as the Enlightenment, when the miracles of science and the gospel of reason began to challenge the old dogmas of religion and faith, and the idea of constitutional and democratic governments challenged the old regimes of Europe. When Leopold recovered from his initial astonishment at his son, he began to view Wolfgang in both those terms, the religious and the practical. The issues in Leopold's mind were roughly these. I believe my son to be a miracle of God. How can I spread the news of that miracle into the world and demonstrate to a rational age that miracles can still happen? Meanwhile, my daughter is a genuine keyboard prodigy. So the other big question is, how can we cash in on this? Leopold's proclaimed goals may have been rooted in the spiritual, but his letters and his concerns from then on have mainly to do with money. Starting when Wolfgang was 6, Leopold took his children on the road. Their tours of the next years covering a good deal of the map of Europe. Germany, Austria, Poland, Holland, England, Italy. The first tour lasted 3.5 years. You might imagine that Wolfgang's legendary early travels would be a rich vein of stories for a biographer to indulge in. Actually, the reverse. The gist of the travels is this. The father would take them to one court and palace after another, all over the map. They would play, and Wolfgang would do his tricks, and everybody would be astonished, and with luck would shower them with gifts, and then they'd go on to the next place where more or less the same thing happened. I spent a certain amount of time cutting pages from my draft about the travels because they became quickly predictable. What was left was a few stories about them and the people they had to make a living from, which was the old aristocracy of Europe in its last untroubled years before the Enlightenment began to question a status quo that had endured for over 1,000 years. So the travels. Wolfgang sits on the lap of the Empress of Austria and gives her a kiss, and she's delighted. He proposes marriage to her little daughter, Maria Antonia, who later married the King of France and became Marie Antoinette, a marriage that didn't turn out so well. The aristocracy of Europe were intricately interconnected, and many of them had a passion for music. Courts competed with one another in the grandness of their musical establishments. This was the milieu the Mozarts moved in, and which they had to make their fame and fortune. Time and again, the Mozarts would arrive in town like a traveling circus act. Nannerl would play, and Wolfgang would do his tricks, naming a pitch at a distance, playing with a cloth over the keys, accompanying a song he'd never heard before, improvising, and of course, playing his violin sonatas and flute sonatas and keyboard pieces. He charms George III of England and the royals of France. At 8, he began to write little symphonies. A couple of years after that, he was writing arias, working toward opera. Leopold was the only teacher his children ever had, in music and otherwise, and clearly he was a brilliant teacher. The long stagecoach journeys were filled with singing and learning, math and history and languages. Both children became fluent in French and Italian. Somebody noticed once that Mozart's Italian was more grammatical than his German. All this was fine with the kids. They loved to perform and were everywhere petted and applauded. Sometimes they got snuff boxes full of gold coins, sometimes clothes, gold watches, jewelry. Sometimes they just got kisses. To Leopold's disgust, he wrote home, "If kisses could pay the rent, we'd be really rich." To a degree, Wolfgang's personality was already in place. Even if Papa could be demanding and stern, Wolfgang grew up a celebrity and everywhere a marvel, and that was great fun. He was full of laughter and rough jokes, took his gifts for granted, and was always ready to show them off. And as for composing, as he wrote, "I compose as easily as a sow piddles." He and his daughter were close, his sister were close, often playing duets in their concerts. Leopold was a tremendous entrepreneur. Before they came to each town, the newspapers would get notification from him of his prodigious children's imminent arrival. In Leopold's letters home during their travels, he usually, by the way, talks about his children, not just his son, and he brags about both of them. As things played out, though, Nannerl, for all her gifts, was never inclined to compose. She submitted to Papa, she stayed by him, and in later years, she always took his side in quarrels with Wolfgang. What about Mozart's Bildung in all this as a person and musician? One way to look at it is that Mozart was a showbiz kid. Think about the other showbiz kids, Mickey Rooney, Michael Jackson, or the child athletes, Olympic athletes whose entire upbringing is centered on one thing, all of it relentlessly controlled by parents or coaches. It's a peculiar way to grow up, and it tends to produce peculiar adults. Leopold controlled every detail of his children's lives. Even though they made the money went into Dad's pocket, and he gave them an allowance. Wolfgang was on an allowance until he left Salzburg in his 20s. So in some ways, Wolfgang never grew up. In adulthood, he had his episodes of jumping over chairs and howling like a cat. He never learned to handle money. Though contrary to myth, he always lived high on the hog and was never really poor. He loved games of skill, shooting and billiards and bowling. You saw his silly side in the play and movie Amadeus, as if that were his only side, but Mozart had many sides, and the main one was an absolute obsession with composing and with growing as an artist. What you can call Mozart's Bildung as a composer was another and more fraught matter. Here's a central point to make about Mozart in his youth. He was a phenomenal mimic. In his very first piece, that little minuet written at age 5, he already knew what a minuet was, what were its characteristic turns of phrase, how the harmony went, and how it was involved with a dance. His music was appealing from early on, but his tide of sonatas and eventually symphonies and arias and dramatic pieces, but it was all steeped in convention. Part of Mozart's gift for mimicry is knowing from early on about conventions of expression. When a scientific type interviewed him in Paris when he was 6, and asked him to improvise an operatic song of rage, the boy set out on a blistering piece on the single word perfido, perfidy, and pounded the harpsichord so furiously that it lifted him right out of his chair. He already knew the means of representing rage on the stage. But that gift of mimicry, just like his early fame as a prodigy, would in the long run do Mozart as much harm as good. When he grew up, he had to convince the musical world that he wasn't a kid anymore, and he had to escape the mimicry, which is to say, get past the mighty edifice of musical convention that dictated so many aspects, not only of musical grammar, but of style and genre, and on and on. I'm going to detour here to make a larger point. For me, as for many people, the 3 greatest composers in Western tradition are J.S. Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. Whether you agree with that or not, I'm sure you'll agree they're up there. What strikes me in comparing these three is that it's a powerful demonstration that there's no one way for genius.